So since most part of our application is done, in this lesson I would like to focus on the refactoring. So first of all, we're going to do some tweaks inside timeline stopwatch component. Let's open it up in our editor, and then in the template, let's take a closer look at this Vue directive. This directive is used to hide or show pause stopwatch button. So basically we need to show stopwatch button whenever current stopwatch is running, so users can stop it. And we can actually check it in a different way by using much easier expression in here. So let's just compare current timeline item object that the current stopwatch component is responsible for with an active timeline item object. And this way we can determine if these two objects are the same. That means the stopwatch of the current timeline item object is currently running. Let's scroll at the very top and remove unused import. Now switching over to a different function, stop timeline item timer. This function is called when we press on stop button. As we can see, in order for this function to work properly, we have to pass the first parameter, the timeline item object, which we have to stop the stopwatch for. But there is actually no need to pass this parameter, because inside of stop timeline item timer function, we can easily determine for which timeline item object we have to stop the stopwatch, because stopwatch can only be stopped for the active timeline item object. So in here I'm going to reference active timeline item computed property instead of referencing timeline item passed as the first parameter. So let's remove the first parameter from here. And because we are also calling this stop timeline item timer down here inside of this watch effect closure, let's remove the first parameter and also move this watch effect function to the top of the file before all function declarations. This is how I like to group things. Firstly, I tend to use all Vue primitives and right after all custom function declarations. We are also no longer referencing timeline item timer constant outside of this module, so we can make this variable private by removing export keyword. And now let's switch over to the storage module and take a look at the implementation of the sync state function. In here we are deciding whether we have to start or stop the timer. And these two functions take active timeline item object as the first parameter. But there is no need to pass active timeline item as a parameter, because we have a global computed property that we can reference from inside of any function. So let's remove this parameter from this function as well as from stop timeline item timer function. But we also have to do minor additional modification of start timeline item timer function, because sometimes when we call this function we do not pass any parameters, and sometimes we do whenever we start timeline item stopwatch manually. In that case we have to know for which timeline item object we'd like to start stopwatch. But when we are calling this function on the initial page load, inside sync state function we always wanna start the timer for the active timeline item object. So in that case we're not passing any parameters. So let's use the following fallback to active timeline item object. And one more thing we're going to do in this lesson is fix one bug related to reset timeline item timer function. So whenever we reset the time of the stopwatch, we also stop the timer. There are actually a couple of scenarios how we can reset the time. First scenario is when we start the timer and then reset the time without actually stopping the stopwatch. In these cases we can see everything works fine. But the second scenario is when we start the stopwatch and then stop it and try to reset the time. In this case, as we can see, we are receiving an error in the console. So before actually stopping the stopwatch, we have to make sure that it is running. I'm going to add additional if statement and check if we have active timeline item. Only in that case we're going to stop the timer. As a reminder, stop timeline item timer function does not accept any parameters anymore. So let's remove this argument. And now back to browser and test this scenario again. Let's start the timer, then stop it and reset the time. In this case, everything worked fine and we didn't get any errors. So let's continue development in the next lesson.